Funny how guys like you always show up after midnight. Officer Ryan Keller's voice cut through the low hum of the diner like a blade across glass. The entire room seemed to stiffen at once. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Forks stopped against ceramic plates. Even the old jukebox near the front window suddenly felt quieter beneath the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the neon-lit glass. Nathaniel Reed slowly looked up from the black leather folder resting beside his untouched cup of coffee. His expression didn't change. Calm eyes, steady breathing, the kind of stillness that made angry people even angrier. He sat alone in the far booth beneath a flickering Budweiser sign, a gray hoodie draped over broad shoulders, silver beginning to show in his beard. The diner smelled like burnt bacon grease and fresh coffee, warm against the cold March storm outside. Nathaniel had been there less than 20 minutes. Long enough to order coffee. Long enough to quietly thank the waitress when she refilled his cup. Long enough for Officer Keller to decide he didn't belong. "Is there a problem, officer?" Nathaniel asked softly. Keller smirked as his partner, Officer Mark Dalton, moved closer beside him. Water dripped from both officers' jackets onto the checkered tile floor. "Depends," Dalton said. "You planning on answering some questions?" Nathaniel folded his hands slowly on the table. "What kind of questions?" Keller glanced toward the cashier counter where a nervous teenage employee whispered something to the cook. Then his eyes dropped back to Nathaniel. "We got a report about a stolen wallet." A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Nathaniel nodded once. "And you believe I took it?" "You fit the description," Keller replied instantly. The waitress, Emily Carter, froze near the coffee machine. "Officer, he's been sitting right there the whole time," she said carefully. Keller didn't even look at her. "Nobody asked you." Emily lowered her eyes, but Nathaniel noticed the tension in her face. Fear. Embarrassment. The kind people carried when they knew something wrong was happening but weren't sure if speaking up would make it worse. Nathaniel reached calmly for his wallet. Keller's hand immediately moved toward his belt. "Easy," he snapped. The diner went silent again. Nathaniel stopped moving. Rainwater rolled slowly down the windows behind him, smearing the red neon light across the glass like bleeding paint. "I was reaching for my ID," Nathaniel said. "You don't need to reach for anything unless we tell you to." Keller stepped closer now, towering over the booth. "Stand up." Nathaniel looked at him for a long moment. Not angry, not intimidated, just tired. Like this wasn't new. Like he'd seen this exact moment in different cities, under different lights, wearing different jackets, his entire life. Slowly he stood. The booth creaked softly behind him. Dalton immediately moved beside him while Keller began patting down his pockets in front of everyone. Emily looked sick watching it happen. Keller pulled out a folded pair of reading glasses, a silver pen, and finally the black leather folder from the table. He opened it carelessly. His smirk faded for half a second. Inside were legal documents stamped with the seal of the state of Illinois. Dalton leaned closer. "What's that?" Keller flipped one page, then another, his jaw tightening slightly before the expression vanished again beneath arrogance. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. Nathaniel calmly reached for the folder. "Those are confidential court documents." Keller snapped it shut before handing it back. "You lawyers always think paperwork makes you untouchable." Nathaniel took the folder quietly and held it against his chest. Then he looked directly at Keller beneath the cold fluorescent lights. "No," he said softly. "Character does that." For the first time all night, Officer Ryan Keller stopped smiling. Officer Ryan Keller stared at Nathaniel Reed for another long second before stepping back from the booth. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, filling the silence that had settled over the diner like fog. Somewhere near the kitchen, a plate clinked against stainless steel, sharp enough to make a few customers flinch. Nathaniel remained standing beside the table, one hand resting calmly on the leather folder against his chest. His coffee had gone cold. Steam no longer rose from the cup. Rain continued sliding down the windows in silver streaks while headlights from passing cars swept through the diner every few seconds, washing the walls in pale light. Keller crossed his arms. "You carry legal paperwork around at 1 in the morning?" he asked. Nathaniel answered evenly. "I came from work." Dalton laughed under his breath. "Yeah? What kind of work keeps a man dressed like that?" Nathaniel glanced down briefly at the faded gray hoodie beneath his wool coat. Tiny drops of rain still clung to the shoulders from when he had walked in 15 minutes earlier. The kind that does not require expensive clothes, he replied quietly. Emily lowered her eyes behind the counter, hiding the smallest smile before fear replaced it again. Keller noticed. You think this is funny? He snapped toward her. No, officer. Then stay out of it. Nathaniel watched the exchange carefully. His expression never changed, but something heavy moved behind his eyes. Not fear. Recognition. Like he already knew exactly how the rest of the night would unfold. Keller stepped closer again. Open the folder. Nathaniel's fingers tightened slightly around the leather edge. Those documents are protected. Not anymore. The diner felt smaller suddenly. Tighter. The old ceiling fans hummed overhead while the smell of grease and coffee thickened in the warm air. Nathaniel slowly handed the folder over without another word. Keller flipped through the papers carelessly. Motions. Case summaries. Judicial conference schedules. Dalton leaned over his shoulder, squinting. You really expect us to believe this? Nathaniel remained calm. Believe what you want. Keller stopped at one page near the center. For the briefest moment, uncertainty crossed his face again. The official gold seal stamped into the paper reflected beneath the fluorescent light. Dalton noticed it too. What is that? Keller shut the folder immediately. Probably fake. Nathaniel exhaled softly through his nose, almost disappointed. You already decided who I was before you walked through that door. Keller's jaw tightened. You got an attitude problem? No, Nathaniel replied. I have a patience problem. Dalton smirked. That sounds like resisting to me. Emily finally stepped forward from behind the register. Her sneakers squeaked lightly against the tile floor. Officers, please. He has been respectful the entire time. Keller turned sharply toward her. You want to lose your job tonight. Emily froze. Nathaniel looked at her gently. It is all right. The kindness in his voice only seemed to irritate Keller more. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the city. A bus splashed through standing rainwater as it passed the diner windows, shaking the neon reflections across the glass. Keller handed the folder back with unnecessary force. Put your hands behind your back. Several customers immediately reached for their phones beneath the tables. Nathaniel did not move at first. His eyes drifted briefly toward the window where his reflection stared back at him beneath the red diner lights. Older now, more tired than he used to be. He thought about the voicemail still sitting unopened on his phone from his daughter in Boston. He thought about the memorial service earlier that evening. About lilies. About silence. About how grief already made a man feel invisible before the world decided to help. Slowly, Nathaniel placed the folder on the table beside the untouched coffee cup and turned around without resistance. The cold metal clicked around his wrists while the diner watched in complete silence. The sound of the handcuffs seemed louder than the thunder outside. Cold metal rested against Nathaniel Reed's wrists while every pair of eyes inside the diner stayed fixed on him. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the cook behind the grill had stopped scraping the spatula across the steel counter. Officer Ryan Keller guided Nathaniel toward the front door with one hand hovering near his shoulder like he expected trouble that never came. But Nathaniel walked calmly beneath the flickering neon lights, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. The leather folder remained behind on the booth table beside the untouched coffee and the silver reading glasses Keller had carelessly tossed aside. Emily noticed it immediately. Sir, she called. Nervously. His things. Dalton grabbed the folder before she could move. Evidence now. Nathaniel paused near the door for half a second. Rain hammered against the glass hard enough to blur the parking lot outside into smears of white and red light. Then he looked back toward Emily. Could you make sure the waitress keeps the tip under the coffee cup? He asked softly. Emily blinked in surprise. Keller gave a dry laugh. You are worried about tips right now? Nathaniel answered without hesitation. People working night shifts deserve kindness too. Emily slowly walked toward the booth after they pushed him outside. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the warm ceramic cup. Beneath it sat 3 folded $100 bills. Her breath caught. Outside, cold rain soaked through Nathaniel's coat almost instantly. Police lights reflected across the wet pavement in violent flashes of red and blue, while passing cars slowed to stare. Dalton opened the back door of the patrol car. Watch your head, he muttered without sincerity. Nathaniel lowered himself carefully into the seat. The leather inside smelled faintly of wet fabric and old coffee. Water rolled down the side windows while Keller climbed into the driver's seat. For several blocks, Nobody spoke. The windshield wipers dragged rhythmically through the storm. Downtown Chicago drifted past in blurred reflections of streetlights, liquor stores, and glowing apartment windows high above the streets. Nathaniel sat quietly in the back seat, staring at the city beyond the rain-covered glass. His wrists ached slightly from the tight metal cuffs, but he never complained. Keller finally glanced into the rearview mirror. "You got priors?" Nathaniel looked up calmly. "No, you expect me to believe that. I do not spend much time worrying about what you believe." Dalton snorted from the passenger seat. "Man talks like he is giving a speech." Nathaniel leaned his head lightly against the seat behind him. "Habit." Keller narrowed his eyes. "You think you are smarter than everybody else." Nathaniel's voice remained level. "No, I think anger makes people careless." Silence settled again. The patrol car turned beneath a flickering traffic light near West Monroe Street. Rainwater splashed beneath the tires while a homeless veteran stood beneath an awning holding cardboard over his head against the storm. Nathaniel noticed him immediately. His gaze lingered there until the car moved on. "You know what your problem is?" Keller asked suddenly. Nathaniel said nothing. "Men like you always act calm because you think it makes you look innocent." Nathaniel slowly turned toward the front seat. "No, officer. I stay calm because somebody has to." Keller's jaw flexed hard enough for Dalton to notice. The younger officer shifted awkwardly in his seat and lowered the radio volume. For the first time all night, uncertainty crept quietly into the car. Not enough to stop what was happening, but enough to disturb it. 15 minutes later, the patrol car rolled beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the precinct garage. Rainwater dripped steadily from the concrete ceiling while officers moved through the station carrying paperwork and paper coffee cups. Keller stepped out first and opened the rear door. Nathaniel carefully emerged from the vehicle, water dripping from the edge of his coat onto the oil-stained floor. A desk sergeant looked up briefly from his computer. "What do we got?" Keller removed his wet gloves slowly. "Possible theft suspect." The sergeant glanced toward Nathaniel for only a moment before typing. "Name?" Nathaniel answered calmly. "Nathaniel Reed." The sergeant froze mid-keystroke. Just for a second. Then his eyes lifted carefully toward Nathaniel's face. The desk sergeant stared at the screen for a moment too long. Rainwater dripped steadily from Nathaniel Reed's coat onto the gray concrete floor while the fluorescent lights above buzzed softly through the station. Around them, officers moved between desks carrying reports and styrofoam coffee cups, but the energy near the booking counter shifted almost instantly. The sergeant looked back at the monitor, then slowly at Nathaniel again. "You said Reed?" he asked carefully. "Nathaniel Reed," Nathaniel repeated calmly. Officer Keller pulled off his wet jacket and tossed it over the back of a chair. "Yeah. What?" The sergeant hesitated. "Nothing." But the way he said it did not sound like nothing. Dalton noticed too. "You know him or something?" The sergeant cleared his throat quickly and resumed typing. "No. Just processing the paperwork." Nathaniel stood silently beside the counter while another officer unlocked the cuffs from his wrists. Red marks circled the skin beneath the fluorescent light, but he rubbed them only once before folding his hands calmly in front of him again. Keller leaned against the desk. "Wallet theft suspect. Witnesses acting difficult." Nathaniel finally spoke. "There was no witness." Keller smirked. "There is always a witness eventually." Nathaniel looked at him steadily. Interesting philosophy for law enforcement. Dalton gave a dry laugh while the desk sergeant kept typing faster than before. Somewhere deeper in the station, a printer spit out paperwork in rapid bursts. Phones rang. A television mounted in the corner quietly replayed late-night news coverage about budget cuts and rising crime downtown. But Nathaniel's attention drifted toward none of it. Instead, his eyes settled briefly on a framed police academy graduation photo hanging crooked near the hallway entrance. Young faces smiling proudly beneath bright summer sunlight. Some black, some white. All believing the badge meant something honorable. A younger officer approached carrying paperwork. "Need him in holding?" Keller nodded immediately. "Until we finish sorting this out." Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. "Sorting out what exactly?" Keller stepped closer again. "You always this difficult?" "No," Nathaniel answered softly. "Only when people confuse confidence with guilt." The younger officer looked uncomfortable now. He glanced between Keller and Nathaniel before lowering his voice. "Sir, maybe we should verify identification first." Keller's eyes narrowed instantly. You questioning procedure? No, sir. Nathaniel watched the exchange quietly. The station smelled faintly of wet coats, old paper, and burnt coffee left too long on a warmer. Outside the garage entrance, thunder rolled low across the city again. Then the desk sergeant's computer chimed. A small sound, sharp enough to stop him cold. He stared at the screen. Once, twice. Then very slowly, he sat straighter in his chair. Dalton noticed immediately. What? The sergeant swallowed. Nothing. But this time, nobody believed him. Keller walked around the desk impatiently. Move. The sergeant hesitated before turning the monitor slightly away. Too late. Keller caught enough of the screen to see the official state judicial profile photo beside Nathaniel Reed's name. His expression changed for half a second. Confusion first, then disbelief. Nathaniel remained completely still beneath the harsh white lights. Calm. Silent. Dalton leaned in beside Keller. What the hell? The desk sergeant immediately minimized the screen. Maybe we should slow down here. Keller turned sharply toward Nathaniel again. You got something you want to tell us? Nathaniel's eyes met his without anger. You never asked. Silence swallowed the room. Even the television in the corner suddenly seemed too loud. Keller stared hard at him now, searching for arrogance, for mockery, for some sign that the older man was enjoying this moment. But Nathaniel's face carried only exhaustion. Deep, familiar exhaustion. The kind built over decades of being judged before speaking. Dalton shifted awkwardly. Judge? He asked quietly, almost not wanting the word to exist out loud. Nathaniel answered with the same calm voice he had used all night. Circuit Court. Keller let out a short laugh that sounded forced even to himself. You expect us to believe you are a judge walking around diners at 1 in the morning dressed like that? Nathaniel glanced briefly at the rain running down the garage windows. My wife used to say grief does not care what you are wearing. The station fell quiet again. Then from the far hallway, a captain's voice suddenly echoed through the room. Why is Judge Reed standing in booking? The captain's voice cut through the station like a crack of thunder. Why is Judge Reed standing in booking? Every conversation nearby seemed to collapse at once. Phones still rang somewhere in the background. A printer continued feeding out paperwork. Rain still tapped steadily against the garage windows. But near the booking desk, nobody moved. Captain Howard Ellis stepped out from the hallway carrying a tablet beneath one arm, his dark blue uniform pressed sharply despite the late hour. He stopped cold the moment he saw Nathaniel Reed standing beneath the fluorescent lights with red marks still visible around his wrists. Judge, Ellis exhaled heavily, disbelief flashing across his face before embarrassment quickly replaced it. Nathaniel gave a small nod. Captain. Keller straightened immediately. Sir, we were investigating a reported theft. Ellis turned slowly toward him. And you arrested a sitting circuit judge without verifying identification first. Keller opened his mouth, but no words came out. Dalton looked down at the floor. The younger desk officers nearby suddenly became very interested in their paperwork. Nathaniel remained still beside the counter, his damp coat hanging heavily from his shoulders. Water continued dripping softly onto the concrete floor beneath him. Captain Ellis stepped forward quickly. Judge Reed, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding. Nathaniel's eyes shifted briefly toward Keller before returning to Ellis. Misunderstandings usually involve both sides making mistakes. The words landed quietly. Somehow that made them worse. Ellis rubbed one hand across his jaw. Sir, if there is anything we can do to correct this tonight. Nathaniel glanced toward the hallway leading deeper into the precinct. There is a young veteran standing 2 blocks from here under a bus stop awning in 40-degree rain. The captain blinked once. Excuse me. Blue army jacket. Gray beard. Missing 2 fingers on his left hand. Nathaniel's voice remained calm. He has been outside for at least 20 minutes. Silence stretched awkwardly again. Nathaniel looked around the station slowly. Perhaps somebody could help him before helping me. The captain lowered his eyes for a second. I will handle it personally. Nathaniel nodded once. Keller shifted beside the desk, visibly uncomfortable now. The confidence that had filled the diner earlier had drained from his face entirely. He looked toward Nathaniel carefully, almost searching for anger he could understand better than silence. Judge Reed, Keller said stiffly, if there was a mistake tonight, then we can clear it up. Nathaniel turned toward him fully for the first time since entering the station. A mistake is spilling coffee on paperwork. His voice stayed soft, controlled. What happened tonight was a choice. Nobody spoke after that. Even Dalton looked shaken now. Captain Ellis immediately motioned toward an office near the hallway. "Judge, please. Let me get you somewhere warmer." Nathaniel picked up the leather folder from the counter where Dalton had finally placed it down moments earlier. The edges were still damp from rainwater and careless handling. He brushed his thumb once across the gold seal on the cover before holding it against his chest again. As he followed Ellis toward the office, several officers quietly stepped out of his path without being asked. The station suddenly felt smaller around him, tighter, like the walls themselves understood something had gone wrong long before anyone admitted it aloud. Inside the captain's office, warm yellow light replaced the harsh fluorescent glare outside. A small desk lamp illuminated stacks of reports while an old coffee machine hummed quietly near the filing cabinets. Ellis closed the door behind them. For a moment, neither man spoke. Nathaniel slowly removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Exhaustion weighed visibly across his face now. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just human. Ellis finally sat across from him. "I heard about your wife," he said carefully. Nathaniel stared silently at the rain streaking down the office window. Downtown lights blurred beyond the glass like fading stars. 3 months ago," he answered quietly. Ellis nodded once. "I am sorry." Nathaniel slipped his wedding ring slightly with his thumb, an absent movement, so practiced it looked unconscious. "Most people are," he said softly. Then after a long pause, he looked back toward the booking area beyond the office window where Keller still stood frozen near the desk. "The problem is," Nathaniel continued, "very few people are sorry before the damage is done." The rain finally began to weaken sometime after 2 in the morning. Small drops slid slowly down the captain's office window while downtown Chicago glowed beneath the storm clouds in soft gold and pale blue reflections. Nathaniel Reed sat quietly in the leather chair across from Captain Ellis's desk, his damp coat folded neatly beside him now. The office heater hummed softly near the filing cabinet, pushing warm air into the silence between them. Ellis had offered coffee twice. Nathaniel declined both times. Not rudely, just without appetite. Outside the office, the station had grown quieter. Fewer phones ringing, fewer voices. Officers moved slower now, speaking in lower tones than before. News of what happened had already begun drifting through the building like smoke. Nathaniel loosened the knot of his tie slightly and stared down at the wedding ring resting against his hand, gold-worn smooth with time. 30 years together reduced now to memory, paperwork, and quiet apartments that no longer felt alive. Ellis finally leaned back in his chair. "You should let us drive you home." Nathaniel gave the smallest shake of his head. "I drove myself." "Your car is still at the diner?" "Yes." Ellis nodded once. Another silence followed. Not hostile, just heavy. The kind that settles into rooms where people realize too late they should have listened sooner. Nathaniel's eyes drifted toward the office window again. Beyond the glass, Keller still stood near booking speaking quietly with Dalton beneath the fluorescent lights. The arrogance was gone now. In its place sat something harder to carry. Nathaniel recognized it immediately. Shame. Real shame always arrived quietly. Ellis folded his hands together on the desk. Ryan Keller was a good officer once. Nathaniel listened without reacting. 8 years ago, Ellis continued softly, he saved a kid during a warehouse fire on the west side. Pulled him out himself before firefighters even got there. Nathaniel finally looked back toward him. And Ellis exhaled slowly. And somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing people and started seeing categories. Rain tapped lightly against the window again. Nathaniel nodded faintly. That happens faster than most people think. Ellis studied him carefully. You are calmer than most men would be tonight. Nathaniel's expression barely shifted. Most men have not spent 50 years learning that anger frightens people more when it comes from someone who looks like me. The words settled heavily into the room. Ellis lowered his eyes for a moment. Nathaniel leaned back slowly in the chair, exhaustion finally visible beneath the calm professionalism he carried so naturally. "Do you know what my wife used to hate most?" he asked quietly. Ellis shook his head. Nathaniel smiled faintly for the first time all night, though sadness rested beneath it. "When people apologized only after discovering my job title." The captain did not know how to answer that. Nathaniel's gaze returned to the rain outside. She used to say respect that depends on status is not respect at all. Somewhere down the hallway, a door opened and closed softly. Footsteps crossed the station floor. The coffee machine near the filing cabinet sputtered loudly before falling silent again. Small, ordinary sounds. Life continuing around moments that changed people forever. Nathaniel slipped his glasses off and rubbed his tired eyes carefully. "Tonight was never really about me," he said. Ellis frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel nodded toward the booking area outside the office. "If I were not a judge, nothing about tonight changes." The truth in the sentence seemed to hollow the air from the room itself. Ellis stared at him silently. Nathaniel looked back toward Keller again through the office glass. The officer now sat alone at an empty desk with both elbows resting on his knees, staring down at the floor beneath the fluorescent lights. Smaller somehow than before. Human. Nathaniel watched him quietly for several seconds. Then he spoke in the same calm voice he had carried all night. "The frightening part is not that men like him exist." Ellis listened carefully. Nathaniel's eyes softened with something almost like grief. "It is how ordinary they become." By 6:30 the next morning, the storm had disappeared completely. Pale sunlight spilled across the Chicago skyline, reflecting against glass towers still, streaked with rain from the night before. Downtown traffic moved slowly beneath the courthouse windows, while people hurried through crosswalks holding coffee cups and briefcases, unaware that inside courtroom 4B, silence already weighed heavier than conversation. Officer Ryan Keller adjusted the collar of his uniform for the third time in less than a minute. His reflection in the polished brass elevator doors looked unfamiliar to him somehow. Tired eyes, tight jaw, sleepless. Beside him, Mark Dalton stood unusually quiet, clutching a thin internal affairs folder against his chest. Neither officer had spoken much since sunrise. The elevator dinged softly as the doors slid open onto the courthouse floor. Marble stretched in every direction beneath warm morning light pouring through tall windows at the end of the hallway. Lawyers moved calmly between courtrooms carrying leather bags and legal files while deputies exchanged quiet greetings near security checkpoints. Everything felt clean, ordered, controlled. Keller suddenly hated it. A bailiff near the courtroom entrance looked up as the two officers approached. "Internal review hearing?" he asked. Dalton nodded quickly. The bailiff checked his clipboard. "Courtroom 4B. Judge Reed presiding." The words hit harder in daylight. Keller's stomach tightened instantly. Dalton looked away toward the windows. For a moment, neither man moved. Then slowly, they entered the courtroom. The room smelled faintly of old wood, paper, and fresh coffee from somewhere down the hall. Morning sunlight stretched across the polished benches in long golden rectangles. A few attorneys quietly reviewed notes near the front while a court reporter adjusted equipment beside the witness stand. Everything looked ordinary except for one thing. Emily Carter sat quietly in the back row wearing the same diner uniform from the night before beneath a borrowed gray coat. Keller froze the moment he recognized her. Emily lowered her eyes immediately. Dalton whispered under his breath, "Why is she here?" Before Keller could answer, the side door near the judge's chambers opened softly. Every person in the courtroom stood at once. "All rise." Nathaniel Reed entered wearing black judicial robes that moved heavily around him as he crossed toward the bench. Gone was the damp gray hoodie. Gone was the tired man beneath neon diner lights. The calm remained, but now it carried authority that filled the entire room without effort. Keller felt heat rise into his face instantly. Nathaniel took his seat slowly beneath the state seal mounted high against the wall. Sunlight touched the silver at his temples while he arranged several files neatly before him. His expression remained unreadable, professional, controlled, yet the red marks around his wrists had not completely faded. Keller noticed immediately. So did Dalton. Nathaniel adjusted his glasses once before looking out across the courtroom. His eyes passed briefly over the attorneys. The bailiff, Emily in the back row. Finally, they settled on the two officers standing near the defense table. Silence stretched through the room, thick enough to hear breathing. Keller lowered his eyes first. Nathaniel spoke calmly. "Be seated." The sound of benches creaking echoed softly through the courtroom as everyone sat. Nathaniel opened the file in front of him with steady hands. "This hearing concerns procedural conduct during a civilian stop and detainment that occurred approximately 12 hours ago." Keller's throat tightened. Nathaniel continued reading from the report without changing his tone. No stolen property was recovered. No formal witness statement was obtained. Identification was not verified prior to detainment. Every sentence landed colder than the last. Emily sat motionless in the back row listening quietly. Nathaniel finally looked up from the file. His eyes met Keller's directly across the courtroom. Not angry, not cruel. Somehow that made it worse. "Officer Keller," Nathaniel said softly, "do you believe reasonable suspicion should be based on behavior or appearance?" The question hung in the courtroom like suspended weight. Keller opened his mouth slightly, but no answer came. Because somewhere between the diner and the courthouse, he had realized the terrifying part was not that he arrested the wrong man. It was how easily he had been certain he was right. Officer Ryan Keller stood motionless near the defense table while the morning sunlight slowly shifted across the courtroom floor. Nathaniel Reed waited patiently behind the bench, hands folded loosely before him, his expression calm enough to make the silence feel even heavier. The courtroom clock ticked softly against the paneled walls. Somewhere outside in the hallway, distant footsteps echoed across marble. But inside courtroom 4B, nobody seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Keller finally cleared his throat. "Behavior," he answered quietly. Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. "Behavior," he repeated. "Then help this court understand what specific behavior justified detainment." Keller's fingers tightened against the edge of the table. "We received a theft report." "From whom?" Nathaniel asked immediately. Keller hesitated. "There was no formal witness." Nathaniel nodded once. "Was stolen property recovered?" "No, Your Honor." "Did the civilian resist?" "No." "Did he threaten officers?" "No." Each answer seemed to shrink the room around Keller inch by inch. Nathaniel lowered his eyes briefly toward the file in front of him before continuing in the same measured voice. "Then explain why forceful escalation became necessary." Keller opened his mouth again, but stopped. Because suddenly the answer sounded different inside a courtroom than it had sounded beneath neon diner lights at 1 a.m. Nathaniel watched him quietly. Not triumphantly. Not coldly. Just steadily. Like a man waiting for honesty more than punishment. Dalton shifted beside Keller, visibly uncomfortable now. Sweat darkened the collar beneath his uniform despite the cool courtroom air. Emily sat silently in the back row with both hands folded tightly in her lap. Nathaniel finally leaned back slightly in his chair. "Officer Keller," he said softly, "last night you believed confidence from a black man was suspicious." The words landed gently. That somehow made them impossible to escape. Keller lowered his eyes. Nathaniel continued. "You saw education as arrogance, calmness as resistance, dignity as defiance." Nobody moved. The court reporter stopped typing for half a second before continuing again. Nathaniel removed his glasses carefully and placed them on the bench beside the file. "Do you know why this matters?" Keller swallowed hard but did not answer. Nathaniel's voice remained calm enough to feel almost painful. Because thousands of people who are not judges walk into diners every night hoping simply to be left in peace. The sunlight near the windows brightened slightly as clouds finally moved away from the city. Dust drifted slowly through the warm morning light above the courtroom benches. Nathaniel looked briefly toward Emily in the back row. Miss Carter attempted to de-escalate the situation. Emily looked startled hearing her name. Nathaniel returned his attention toward Keller. Yet her words carried less weight than your assumptions. Keller's face tightened with something deeper than embarrassment now. Regret. Real regret. Nathaniel saw it immediately. After years on the bench, he had learned the difference between shame for getting caught and shame for finally understanding. The courtroom remained completely silent as Nathaniel folded his hands once more. "This court is not interested in humiliation," he said. "Humiliation solves nothing." Keller looked up slowly for the first time since the hearing began. Nathaniel held his gaze evenly. But accountability matters. Especially when authority enters a room before compassion does. Dalton stared down at the floor beside him. Nathaniel glanced briefly toward the internal affairs representatives seated near the front row before speaking again. "The recommendation of this court is immediate review of procedural conduct, mandatory bias evaluation, and temporary suspension pending investigation." Keller closed his eyes briefly. The words were professional, measured, yet somehow heavier than anger would have been. Nathaniel paused for a moment before adding one final thing. "Officer Keller, Keller looked up again. Nathaniel's voice softened almost imperceptibly. Last night, you asked what kind of work keeps a man dressed like me awake at 1 a.m. The courtroom stayed perfectly still. Nathaniel slipped his glasses back on slowly. The kind that spends every day trying to make certain people still believe justice belongs to them too. The hearing ended without noise. No raised voices. No dramatic final statements. Just the quiet scrape of chairs against polished wood as people slowly stood beneath the warm morning light filling courtroom 4B. Nathaniel Reed closed the final file carefully and remained seated for a moment after everyone else began leaving. The courtroom doors opened and closed softly as attorneys stepped into the hallway carrying briefcases and paper coffee cups, already moving on to the next case, the next meeting, the next ordinary part of their day. But for Officer Ryan Keller, nothing felt ordinary anymore. He stood near the defense table long after Dalton quietly disappeared into the hallway. The courtroom had emptied almost completely now except for Emily Carter gathering her coat in the back row and the court reporter organizing documents near the clerk's station. Nathaniel finally removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose slowly. The exhaustion from the previous night still sat heavily across his face. Keller noticed it more now than before. Not weakness, weariness, the kind carried by people who spend years surviving things they should never have needed to survive in the first place. Keller swallowed hard before finally stepping forward. Your Honor. Nathaniel looked up calmly. Keller hesitated. The sunlight through the tall courthouse windows illuminated dust floating quietly through the room between them. I owe you an apology, Keller said at last. Nathaniel studied him silently for a few seconds. Yes, he answered softly. The honesty in the response made Keller lower his eyes again. I thought I was doing my job, Keller admitted. Nathaniel folded his hands loosely on the bench. Most harm begins with people believing they are justified. Keller nodded faintly. His uniform suddenly felt heavier than it had yesterday. I never thought of myself as, he stopped. The word would not come easily. Nathaniel finished it gently. Biased. Keller said nothing. Nathaniel leaned back slightly in the chair. The dangerous people are rarely the ones shouting slurs in public. His voice remained calm and measured. It is the ones who stop noticing their assumptions entirely. Emily stood quietly near the back row listening without meaning to. Nathaniel noticed her and gave a small nod of appreciation toward the young waitress. She smiled faintly before slipping out into the hallway, leaving the two men alone beneath the soft morning light. Keller stared toward the floor for a long moment. I saw your hoodie before I saw you. Nathaniel's eyes